It wasn't a decision I made lightly, but after grandfather died, there was no one left to take care of Grandma. She was old, fragile, and alone on that isolated farm, miles away from the nearest town. I couldn't let her stay by herself, even though I had my own life to live. So, I packed up my things and moved into the house where I'd spent countless childhood summers. It wasn't the same anymore. The house felt off. At first, I chalked it up to grief. The rooms were too quiet, the air too thick with the memory of someone who had recently died. My grandmother, who had always been this vibrant, fiery woman, seemed distant, as if her mind was somewhere far away. I noticed it almost immediately, the way she talked, as if someone else were in the room. I'd find her sitting in the dark living room, mumbling softly under her breath, her eyes fixed on something I couldn't see. Sometimes she would just stare into the void, muttering things I couldn't understand. I thought it was the grief talking. I thought she was simply losing herself in the overwhelming silence left by grandfather's death. But soon, it became apparent that something far more sinister was at play. Grandma's sleep became irregular. Most nights, she wouldn't sleep at all. I'd hear her footsteps shuffling across the wooden floors in the dead of night. I'd lie in bed, heart pounding in my chest, listening to her moving around the house, going from room to room as if searching for something or someone. And then, she started trying to leave the house. It would always be around midnight. I'd wake up to the sound of the front door creaking open and find her standing outside on the porch, staring out into the darkness of the field that stretched endlessly beyond the house. "Grandma?" I'd call softly, trying not to startle her. She wouldn't respond at first. She'd just stand there, looking out at the night with this vacant expression on her face. Then, after a long, tense silence, she'd whisper, "They're calling me." I'd pull her back inside, wrap her in a blanket, and try to convince her to go back to bed. But every night, she would try again. I told myself she was sleepwalking. It made sense, didn't it? She was old, grieving, her mind not as sharp as it used to be. It had to be sleepwalking. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. As the days passed, the house itself seemed to turn against me. At first, it was small things. A door that wouldn't stay closed, a light that flickered despite being brand new. But then the incidents escalated. One night, I walked into the kitchen and found the gas stove turned on, the flame burning bright with no one around. I hadn't used the stove that evening. I turned it off, confused, but when I checked again an hour later, it was on again. The next day, I found all the doors in the house wide open, as if someone, or something, had gone through every room and deliberately unlocked and opened each door. Grandma was in her room at the time, fast asleep, and I knew I hadn't opened them. Then there was the dog, my grandmother's old, loyal hound. Every night, without fail, the dog would whimper and scratch at the door at exactly 10 p.m. No matter how much I tried to calm it, the dog would panic until I let it out. It would run off into the night and return hours later, exhausted and trembling. And every time it came back, it would refuse to come near Grandma. I knew my grandmother had been going to church for years. It was a small, unassuming building on the outskirts of town, nestled between the woods and a long-abandoned farmhouse. She had always been devout, but after my grandfather passed, her devotion seemed to shift into something darker. I first noticed the change when I came across her in the kitchen one morning, eating raw meat. It was a slab of steak, still bloody and dripping, and she sat at the table, cutting it into small pieces and putting them in her mouth with a blank, almost robotic expression. The sight of it made my stomach turn. "Grandma, what are you doing?" I asked, horrified. She looked up at me, her eyes glassy and distant. "It's part of the ritual," she said simply, as if that explained everything. "What ritual?" I asked, but she didn't answer. She just went back to eating. That's when I started to ask around about the church. The locals were reluctant to talk about it at first, but after some persistence, I learned that it wasn't a normal church. Not anymore. It had started out as a regular congregation, but over the years, something had changed. A new preacher had arrived, Pastor Gideon, they called him, and after his arrival, the church had become different. The sermons were no longer about love and forgiveness. Instead, they were about sacrifice and suffering. The congregation had dwindled, but the few who remained were fiercely loyal, attending strange midnight services and participating in rituals that no one outside the church knew about. It wasn't long after this that my grandmother began killing animals. One morning, I woke up to find blood smeared across the front step. At first, I thought something had happened to the dog, but when I followed the trail, I found my grandmother in the backyard, standing over the body of a goat. She had slit its throat and was holding a large, rusty knife in her trembling hands. "Grandma, what the hell are you doing?" I screamed, rushing toward her. She didn't look at me. Her eyes were fixed on the goat's body, her lips moving in a whisper. "It's for the preacher," she murmured. "It's for him." I tried to pull the knife from her hands, but she clutched it tightly, refusing to let go. Her grip was surprisingly strong for someone so frail. When she finally let go, she collapsed to her knees, sobbing. "I have to give it to him," she said through her tears. "I have to. If I don't, he'll make me do worse." I didn't know what she meant at the time. But that night I followed her. It was around 1 a.m. when I saw her sneaking out of the house, carrying the body of the goat in her arms. She didn't see me as I followed her, keeping my distance, hidden in the shadows. She walked through the field, past the tree line, and toward the church. The building loomed in the distance, its steeple barely visible against the dark sky. As she approached, I saw a group of people standing outside the church, their faces hidden by the shadows. They wore long, hooded robes, and I could hear them chanting softly, their voices blending together in a low, eerie hum. My grandmother walked up to the group and knelt before them, placing the goat's body at their feet. One of the figures stepped forward, and I recognized him immediately, Pastor Gideon. He was tall, with a gaunt, hollow face and piercing eyes that seemed to glow in the darkness. He looked down at my grandmother and smiled, a cruel, predatory smile. "You have done well, Sister Margaret," he said, his voice smooth and hypnotic. "Your offering will not go unnoticed." My grandmother bowed her head, trembling. "Thank you, Pastor," she whispered. The other robed figures surrounded the goat's body, their chanting growing louder. I watched in horror as Pastor Gideon raised his hands above his head and began to speak in a language I didn't recognize. The air around me grew colder, and I felt a sharp, biting wind whip through the trees. The chanting reached a fever pitch, and suddenly, the goat's body jerked violently, as if something had taken hold of it. The blood from its throat began to flow upward, defying gravity, pooling in midair before disappearing into the darkness. I stumbled backward, terrified by what I had just witnessed. I turned to run, but before I could move, I heard Pastor Gideon's voice. "We are not finished." The next day, I found my grandmother standing in the kitchen, holding a knife. It wasn't the same rusty knife she had used to kill the goat. This one was newer, sharper. She looked up at me as I entered the room, her eyes red and puffy from crying. "Grandma, what's going on?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Why are you doing this?" She shook her head, her hands trembling as she gripped the knife. "He's in my head," she whispered. "I can't stop him. I can't." I stepped toward her, but she backed away, raising the knife as if to defend herself. Tears streamed down her face as she whispered, "Run. Save yourself." "I can't stop it." "Stop what?" I asked, my voice shaking. "What's happening?" She didn't answer. She just stood there, clutching the knife, her whole body trembling. That night, I locked my bedroom door and pushed a chair in front of it. I didn't sleep. As the days went by, my grandmother's behavior became more erratic. She stopped eating, stopped sleeping, and spent most of her time sitting in the living room, staring into the void. I tried to get help. I called doctors, tried to get her to agree to see a therapist, but she refused. She was too far gone, her mind completely ensnared by Pastor Gideon and whatever hold he had over her. The church's influence grew stronger as well. More and more people from the town began attending services, and rumors spread of strange disappearances, of animals being found mutilated in the fields, and of strange lights seen at night near the church. I knew that I had to stop it, but how could I fight something I didn't understand? One night, I was going through some old boxes in the attic, looking for any documents that might help me understand what was happening to my grandmother. That's when I found it, an old journal, hidden beneath a pile of dusty books. It belonged to my grandfather. As I flipped through the pages, my blood ran cold. The journal detailed my grandfather's suspicions about the church, about Pastor Gideon. He had noticed the same strange behavior in my grandmother, the same midnight rituals, the same obsession with sacrifices. But there was something else, something far worse. The journal spoke of a ritual, a final ritual, one that required the ultimate sacrifice, the blood of a loved one. The journal ended abruptly, the last entry written just days before my grandfather's death. My grandfather hadn't died of natural causes. He had been killed by my grandmother, under Pastor Gideon's control. And now it was happening again. The night after I discovered the journal, I woke up to the sound of my bedroom door creaking open. My heart raced as I reached for the lamp, but before I could turn it on, I saw her. My grandmother stood over me, holding the knife. Her eyes were wide with terror, her hands trembling as she raised the blade. "I'm sorry," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I can't stop him." I scrambled out of bed, knocking over the lamp as I backed into the corner of the room. "Grandma, please," I begged. "You don't have to do this." But it wasn't her anymore. The woman standing in front of me wasn't my grandmother. She was something else. Something controlled, manipulated, twisted by the dark influence of Pastor Gideon and his church. She lunged at me, the knife gleaming in the dim light. I grabbed the nearest object, a heavy book, and swung it at her. The impact knocked her off balance, and she fell to the floor, the knife slipping from her grasp. For a moment there was silence. Then she began to sob. "I'm so sorry," she cried. "I'm so sorry. I knew what I had to do. If I didn't stop Pastor Gideon, if I didn't put an end to the church, it wouldn't stop. My grandmother would be lost to whatever dark force had taken hold of her, and I would be next." I grabbed the knife and left the house, heading toward the church in the dead of night. The wind howled through the trees, and the air was thick with a sense of impending doom. When I reached the church, the doors were open, and inside, I could hear the low, rhythmic chanting of the congregation. The same chant I had heard the night they sacrificed the goat. I stepped inside, my heart pounding in my chest, and there, standing at the front of the room, was Pastor Gideon. He smiled when he saw me, his eyes gleaming with a malevolent light. "I've been expecting you," he said. "What happened next is a blur. I remember the knife in my hand, the weight of it as I gripped it tightly. I remember the cold, lifeless faces of the congregation as they stood around me, watching with vacant eyes as I approached the preacher. And I remember his words, whispered softly like a lullaby. 'You cannot stop me. You are too late.' But I wasn't too late. I couldn't be. With a scream of rage and terror, I lunged at him, the knife slicing through the air. I expected him to fight back, to overpower me with whatever dark power he had used to control the others. But instead, he smiled. As the blade plunged into his chest, he whispered one final word. "Enjoy the curse." And then everything went black. I woke up in the hospital a few days later. The police had found me lying unconscious in the church, surrounded by the bodies of the congregation. They had no explanation for what had happened. No one could understand how an entire group of people had died without a single sign of struggle. My grandmother was dead too. But I was alive. And yet, something was wrong. I could feel it. The curse wasn't gone. It had only just begun. It started slowly. At first, I convinced myself it was all in my head, the aftermath of a trauma, a consequence of everything I had been through. After the preacher's death, after the deaths of the congregation, I left the town, hoping that distance would free me from the horror that had taken root in my life. But the curse, it followed me. I thought that by leaving, by starting fresh in a new town, I could escape what had happened. I rented a small house on the edge of a quiet suburban neighborhood, far from the rural farm and the dark memories of the church. It was a quaint place, somewhere I hoped I could find peace, somewhere I could bury the nightmares of what had happened to my grandmother. But the words, his words, came with me. They started in whispers, faint and almost imperceptible, like the rustling of leaves or the soft creak of floorboards in the night. At first, I couldn't make out what they were saying, but I recognized the cadence, the rhythm of the preacher's sermons. His voice was deep, melodic, and relentless, burrowing into my mind as I lay awake at night. I tried to ignore it, to convince myself that it was nothing more than a lingering trauma. But as the nights went on, the whispers grew louder, more insistent, and then they became clearer. Blood, sacrifice, suffering. I knew those words. I had heard them before, in the church, in the rituals. They had been the same words spoken over the bodies of the animals, over the bodies of the congregation. They were the preacher's words, his words, and now, they were in my head. After a few months of living in isolation, I decided it was time to reconnect with my family. I hadn't seen much of them since the events with Grandma. I had kept my distance, not wanting to burden them with the darkness I carried, but the isolation was wearing on me. I needed the comfort of familiar faces. So, I reached out to my younger sister, Mia. Mia had always been the light in my life, carefree, bubbly, and full of optimism. She lived with her husband and 2 kids in a nearby city, far enough away from the town where it all began but still close enough that I could visit regularly. When I called her, she was excited to hear from me, and we made plans for me to come stay for a week or 2, just to reconnect and spend time together. At first, everything was fine. Mia welcomed me into her home with open arms, and her kids, my niece, Lily, and nephew, Noah, were as sweet and innocent as ever. It felt good to be around family again, to have normal conversations, to laugh and pretend, for a little while, that everything was okay. But then, the words followed me. The first night at Mia's house, I woke up to the familiar sound of whispers. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me, as it had so many nights before. But this time, the whispers weren't coming from inside my head. They were coming from the room next to mine, Lily's room. I crept out of bed, my heart pounding, and pressed my ear to the wall. I could hear the faint murmur of Lily's voice, speaking in a low, monotone whisper. The words were muffled, but I could make out bits and pieces of what she was saying. Blood, sacrifice, suffering. My stomach twisted in knots. I opened the door slowly, and there she was, Lily, sitting up in bed, her eyes half open but unfocused, as if she were in some sort of trance. She was speaking the preacher's words, repeating them in a soft, hypnotic voice, over and over again. I rushed to her side, shaking her gently. "Lily! Lily, wake up!" She blinked, her eyes fluttering open as she snapped out of the trance. She looked up at me, confused and groggy. "Auntie?" she murmured, rubbing her eyes. "What's wrong?" I forced a smile, trying to hide the terror bubbling inside me. "Nothing, sweetie. You were just talking in your sleep." She yawned and lay back down, her head sinking into the pillow. Within moments, she was asleep again, as if nothing had happened. But I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that clung to me like a second skin. The curse, it was spreading. Over the next few days, I began to notice more and more strange behavior in Mia's household. It wasn't just Lily. Noah started waking up at odd hours, wandering around the house in a daze. I'd find him standing in the hallway, staring blankly at the walls, mumbling to himself in that same low, eerie tone. Mia, too, seemed different. At first, I thought it was just my paranoia getting the better of me, but there was something off about the way she spoke, the way she moved. She was always distracted, her eyes unfocused, as if she were listening to something I couldn't hear. And sometimes, when I caught her off guard, I'd see her lips moving silently, as if she were reciting something to herself. I confronted her one morning over breakfast. "Mia," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Have you noticed anything strange lately? She looked up from her coffee, her brow furrowing. What do you mean? I mean, have you noticed anything unusual? Like, the kids waking up at night? Or you? I don't know, feeling different. Mia laughed, though it sounded forced. Oh, come on, you know how kids are. They go through phases. And me? I've just been stressed with work, that's all. But I wasn't convinced. Something was happening to my family, something that had followed me here. The preacher's words had infected them, just like they had infected me. One night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps outside my room. I opened the door and saw Mia, standing in the hallway, her eyes glazed over, her lips moving silently. Mia! I called softly, but she didn't respond. She began walking down the hallway, her steps slow and deliberate. I followed her, keeping a safe distance, my heart racing with fear. She walked toward the kitchen, where the knife block sat on the counter. I watched in horror as Mia picked up a large butcher knife, her grip tight and steady, her movements controlled. She turned slowly, her eyes locking onto me, but they weren't her eyes anymore. They were empty, devoid of life, just like Grandma's had been. The preacher's words echoed in my mind. Blood, sacrifice, suffering. I backed away, my mind racing for a way to stop her. But before I could do anything, Mia's lips parted, and she spoke in a voice that wasn't hers. He's coming. The next day, I decided I couldn't stay silent any longer. I had to tell Mia everything, the church, the preacher, the curse. I knew she wouldn't believe me, but I had to try. I had to warn her before it was too late. I sat her down in the living room, and as calmly as I could, I explained everything. At first, she listened in stunned silence, her face growing paler with each passing moment. But as I reached the part about the preacher's death, her expression changed. She stood up suddenly, shaking her head. No. This isn't real. You're crazy. I'm not crazy, I pleaded. Mia, please, you have to believe me. The preacher, he's controlling you. He's controlling all of us. But she wouldn't listen. She stormed out of the room, leaving me standing there, helpless. That night the whispers returned. Only this time, they weren't just in my head. They were in Mia's voice. I couldn't let it happen again. I couldn't let the preacher take my family the way he had taken Grandma, the way he had taken me. I stayed up that night, watching over Mia and the kids, determined to protect them from whatever dark force was lurking in the shadows of the house. But as the hours ticked by, I began to realize that it wasn't the preacher I needed to fear, it was myself. The words were no longer just whispers. They were commands, seeping into my thoughts, taking hold of my mind like a parasite. I could feel the preacher's influence growing stronger, his words pushing me to do things, terrible things. Blood, sacrifice, suffering. The knife was still in the kitchen, gleaming under the dim light. I couldn't stop myself. My body moved of its own accord, my feet carrying me down the hallway toward Mia's room. I stood over her bed, the knife in my hand, the preacher's voice whispering in my ear. She must be sacrificed. My hand trembled as I raised the knife. Mia lay there, sleeping peacefully, unaware of the danger looming over her. But before I could bring the knife down, she opened her eyes. And in that moment I saw it. The preacher's eyes, staring back at me through my sister's face. Mia's lips curled into a smile that wasn't hers. Her voice, deep and unnatural, filled the room. You thought you could escape me? I stumbled back, dropping the knife in horror. It was never your grandmother, Mia said, rising from the bed. It was always you. You were the one I wanted. No, I whispered, shaking my head. This can't be happening. You've been mine since the beginning, the voice hissed. The curse wasn't passed on. It was born within you. The room seemed to spin as the horrifying truth settled in. The preacher hadn't cursed my grandmother. He had cursed me. And now there was no escaping it. Mia, the preacher, stepped toward me, her eyes glowing with malevolent power. You belong to me. I left Mia's house the next morning. I had no choice. I couldn't stay. not after what I had learned. The preacher's curse wasn't something I could escape. It wasn't something I could fight. It was a part of me now, living inside me, controlling me. I moved far away, to another city, hoping that distance would weaken the preacher's hold. But deep down, I knew it wouldn't. No matter where I went, no matter how far I ran, he would always be there, whispering in the dark. And now, as I lay awake at night, I hear the words again. Blood, sacrifice, suffering. And I know that, one day, I'll be the one standing over someone with a knife. Because the curse never dies. It just passes on.